Okay, this video is going to be more directly about Walt Whitman's poem, Song of Myself, which again comes from his collection, Leaves of Grass. If you haven't already watched the video where I introduce these ideas about imagery and the poem in close reading, then I recommend doing that first. You could probably catch up as we go, but at the same time, it might be nice to have a little bit of that background as we go forward. The thing to remember here is that we're thinking about at the moment how Walt Whitman uses his imagery and why he's trying to say what he's trying to say, and what he's trying to say. We have to figure all these things out at the same time. And we're not always going to come up with the perfect answer, but there are certain elements that can help us do this. The purpose of this particular video is to make sure that you have something to watch as I try to walk through a poem. So it's almost like an example essay, all right, given in video form. So I'll show you the poem shortly and I'll explain a little bit about it. The main thing to remember I want to start with here is, again, we're talking about at this point how he's going to use his imagery, how do we close read it, how do we pay attention to all these elements. What I want to stress to you to start off with, though, okay, is that, again, this is coming from a book called Leaves of Grass, and I want to start there with that image, okay, and it's an image because we can see it, right? If I was asked you to close your eyes, could you draw and imagine in your imagination here a field of grass? And more than likely, I'm assuming that you can, you understand it. And typically, when we think about grass, we think about it as a singularity, right? Grass is, like if you have a lawn, for instance, we think of it as one sort of uniform blanketed space, okay? And in fact, if you think about like, let's think about a golf course, for instance. That's a good example of one. In a golf course, it's just one, it attempts to be one uniform experience, right, with different levels of grass in different places where you might call it the rough or whatever. But the idea is to create it as uniform as you possibly can. That's what gives it almost its beauty when you drive by one of those places, or if you're playing on one. But in actuality, grass is not, of course, a singularity, right? When we think of grass, right, it's actually a plurality. There's infinitesimal blades of grass, or as he calls them, leaves of grass. So in this sense, this image, a leaves of grass, right, is calling out the individual within the collective, right, the singular within the plurality that appears as singularity. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, the way I close read that, and that's what this is doing right now, I'm taking an image and I'm trying to break it down and understand it in its complexities, right? If we think about the idea of like a democratic nation, right? The United States, right? Theoretically, we are this democratic nation, which we're more like a democratic republic. But the idea is that in a democracy, right, each person has a voice, right? So each individual person has a voice that we consider that could be the vote, which is a good way to think about that. But you are theoretically the person who's helping run the country, okay? So what we have to think about is that when America was a young country, when you look at it from the outside, and you can even do this today, right? If you look at outside news sources like Al Jazeera, sorry, it's my cat, like Al Jazeera or BBC News or however you want to, another foreign place, what they're going to show us is like as a country that's a whole, right? America as a singularity. But if you've spent any time here at all, that's not true. I mean, the Deep South is a lot different than like Massachusetts, and Massachusetts is dynamically different than Oklahoma and California. And those are, again, still, like Oklahoma is still not a singularity. It's a plurality. It's made up of all of these individual people. And so his idea with this particular image is to show us that we are a plurality, right, that can easily be seen as a singularity, right? We can easily make the mistake of saying that we all are, one, right, which isn't true. It's just not true. And you can take this down to a much more local level. You can think about like you're all Wofford students, right? And so Wofford from the outside has a very particular singularity, right? Even if you ever watch like in the tournaments when Wofford makes it into the NCAA tournament, when you listen to those people talking about in ESPN, these things are coming out. They talk about Wofford as if it's all this one thing. But if you've spent any time on campus, which for some of you maybe not have, you understand there's a varied amount of information always being processed at that institution, and you are one individual leaf of this field. And if you get down close enough and you look at individual leaves in a field of grass, you'll notice that they are different from one another, depending on how they came up from the earth, right? As you are from the people next to you, right? So the image he's giving us with the title of his book, Leaves of Grass, is asking us to pay attention to individual leaves. And that's the first thing he wants us to do, is to pay attention, right? A lot of this class is built on focus, specificity, really looking at the world that we're in. And so his first thing is like, stop, slow down, look at individuality. Because if you don't, right, and this is a good question to think about that I don't have an answer to exactly, but I'm going to have thoughts. The question is like, what happens when we take a plurality and we turn it into a singularity? What do we lose when we make that transition? And does this lead to war? Does this lead to misunderstandings? I mean, again, I don't know, right? Maybe there's not a one-to-one correlation, but it's something to think about, and he wants you to think about that. So Leaves of Grass is the title of his book. And again, keeping in mind that one of the major images that he's going to use throughout this text, right, is the image of grass. It's going to be a metaphor for him, which we can talk more about, right? But it stands in for something else, right? So we are the country, right? The nation is grass, and all of us are these leaves that are in there, right? So now if you look at the title of the poem that we're going to have here, that I have brought up, is entitled Song of Myself. So that kind of makes sense when you think about the leaves of grass. So he's an individual leaf, right? A blade of grass, an individual leaf in here. And he's now going to sing about himself, about what his song is as an individual blade of grass. So, you know, if you think about this on your end, which is, okay, consider, what do you think that would look like for you? What does your song of yourself, what would it include? What does it have in it? What are some elements that you would want it to be? Do you think it'd be complicated? Would it be simple? How long would it take, right, for you to really get off the song, to really make sure that we can hear everything about you, that you're heard, that your experience is cataloged and given over? And what we can do really quickly is try to understand this poem as a song, right? So he's broken this up into three. First, he wants us to think about there's going to be a song. So songs have all kinds of elements that work with them. Their musicality, they have refrains, they develop a certain kind of rhythm as you go for it. It's musically based, right? So that's important. It's musically based. This is a song. It isn't so, it would be different if this was like Story of Myself. That's a different genre, right? But he's like, no, this is to be sung, right? So that's important. So let's think about the fact that there's a musicality to this as well. And he's saying it's of myself, which, you know, I don't know how that resonates with you. I mean, I think there's a real sense of maybe like self-involvement with that, of selfishness. It kind of comes across that way to us a little bit, maybe not. But it's claiming he's going to sing about himself, right? And so we think about, okay, well, let's look at what that actually looks like. So I'm just going to scroll down and don't try to follow along or anything with that with your eyes. But if you'll notice, all right, this is a very long poem, right? The last section, section 52, all right? So it took him 52 sections, right? And some of them are varied in length. They go for very long, some of them are very short. They cover all kinds of information. And that makes sense because we're complicated individuals. So just by looking at the structure of this poem, by looking at it, we can make a bit of an argument that says, like, the very fact that he needs 52 sections, what we're going to call strophes, right? 52 strophes, so that we can use them interchangeably. That's okay. That we're complicated individuals. We're compelling, complicated individuals. And it's going to take a lot of time for us to really understand that. And so we're not going to read the whole poem, right? As I've already said, we're going to look at certain components of this particular poem. And the one we're going to look at this morning, if you look at your syllabus, you need to read, I think there's 5 choices for you, 5 different poems. And we're going to look at this one together, this opening strophe, stanza 1, right? Strophe 1, okay? And in this, we're starting here, right? And I'm going to call this again strophe 1, right? Strophe 1 has in it 1, 2, 3, 4 stanzas, right? 4 stanzas. A stanza is this, okay? That's a stanza. We would call that a 3-line stanza. There's a word for that, okay? It's called a tercet, but I'm not interested in that at the moment. If you can get to there in this course, that's amazing, and I'm happy for you. But this is called a stanza, and I see 4 stanzas in here, okay? So do I have anything to really talk about with that right now? No, not necessarily, but it does seem interesting to me. There's 4 of them. Maybe that's something I can work with later. I put that down as one of my notes. The next thing that I see is that the lines aren't uniform, right? When I talk about line, this is line 1, okay, here. And then this is line 2. and so on, line 3. And even though it's a new stanza, it's still the line count, that's line 4 and line 5. So I can look at this through its lines, and I can see that like there's no real structure to this. There's no sense of uniformity, right? They go very long, they come to very short. There's no real, I don't know what the word for it is, but there's no structure, there's no rule that he's following at this point, except that this is where he feels like the line needs to get longer. It's where it needs to be shorter. And he's talking about himself, right? He's singing about himself. So we start to think about, well, is there any connection between thinking about having a long line, which is a little bit more breathless, takes a little bit more time in the self, and a short line? Maybe, maybe not, right? But the idea is that the visuality of this, the visual aspect of the poem, is telling us that, that this is lacking uniformity, right? It's lacking a kind of preset cohesion. And I think when we consider what the self is, that makes sense, right? We're not preset. We're not incredibly cohesive narratively in our own imaginations. I think most of us, right, historically speaking, are kind of a mess. We feel like our minds are running 1,000 miles an hour. There's no real guaranteed space for ourselves. Sometimes we feel very comfortable in a position, and sometimes it can all wildly feel like we're going all over the place. And this can happen within a span of, a few minutes, right? So there's a kind of playfulness in that regard. So we haven't even really gotten to the poem yet, but we can already start to think about, the length of the poem, the structure of the poem, the line length, the title of it, and we can already start to form a little bit of a discussion about what this poem is, and how this poem is trying to operate. And that's what we mean by close reading. We mean to say, we're going to look at things closely, we're going to complicate them, we're going to try to understand where they're complicated, and we're going to see if we can arrive at something. That's kind of our goal, to come into an arrival. All right. So I'll end that here, and then the next video we'll actually look at the poem and look at that first strophe and see if there's anything about that we can't take, and make sure that we understand it as we go forward. So that's that. All right, we'll start the next one in a minute.